Okay, we continue our journey with Elisha, and after the very interesting encounter with these young men that we read about last week, we go to the 3rd chapter of 2nd Kings, and it's again an interesting story, of course. 2 Kings 3, we will read the first 3 verses to begin with. Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria, the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 12 years. And he wrought evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father and like his mother, for he put away the image of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless, he cleaved unto the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. He departed not therefrom. Okay, so a few things. First of all, the first verse, since it's in many chapters in the Old Testament, it speaks about which king, which year of the reign of that specific king. And so it sets a time. But here it's also interesting that it mentions that Jehoram begins to reign over Israel from Samaria. And at the same time, Jehoshaphat is king over Judah. So you have to look at the map, and this is why I provided this map. Israel, the nation of God, is divided into two parts. The northern part, which is called Israel, and the southern part, which is called Judah. And so we have two kings, and we see this all the time throughout these many stories in the Old Testament, these two kings. So in the south, in Judah, from Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat is reigning, and he is reigning already for 18 years. He is an experienced king, and so we can read a lot about him in 1 Kings and also later in Chronicles, etc. But he's an experienced king, and here is Jehoram. He is inexperienced. He's a young man. He must be in his early 20s, whereas Jehoshaphat at this point is, if I calculated correctly, he's 53 at this point. So he's more experienced, obviously. So that's something to have in mind. Then we see that, well, we can look at the names also. That's also interesting. Jehoram means the Lord raises up. And that's, of course, a very nice name. The Lord raises up. And Jehoshaphat means the Lord has judged. We talked about the name Jehoshaphat, of course, when we went through the genealogy of Jesus. We talked about him also with regards to the words that Jesus speaks in Matthew 24. Made there a link with the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is also the valley of judgment. Anyway, so that's the names. And it says Jehoram was evil. Now he was not as evil as his parents, it says then. Now his parents, of course, were Ahab and Jezebel. And they were really very evil. We know this. There are many stories about it. He was not as evil as them, but he was evil. He wrought evil in the sight of the Lord. He put away the image of Baal that his parents had set up. But then it says he did not away with the sins of Jeroboam. And you have to go back to 1 Kings 12 to find out what Jeroboam did. He put up golden calves as objects of worship, both in Judah and in Israel. And so he was actually repeating the sin that the Israelites did in the desert when Moses was on the mount, and he made Israel worship these golden calves. And so that's why it says he made Israel to sin. And this worshipping of calves, Jehoram did not do away with it, it says. He did not do away with this. So, he did something, but he left a very bad thing. So what can we learn from this already? It's very interesting. First of all, there are degrees in sin. You can see there are degrees in sin. He was evil, but not as evil as his parents. So there are degrees. And why are there degrees? Because of the impact sin has. There are many sins that have an impact on the sinner's own life. You can sin against your own life. and eternal life, of course. But there are also sins that have an impact on others' lives. So what Jeroboam did, putting up these calves and making the Israelites worship them, it literally says here, by the way, he made Israel to sin. So now you drag in this case, thousands of other people in this sin. So there you see there is a sense of degree. So it is an improvement when evil becomes less. That's an improvement. So doing away with this image of Baal, that's a good thing. Doing away with it. But evil is still evil. It doesn't make Jehoram a good person because he did this. And so it says actually he wrought evil in the sight of the Lord. In spite of this act that he did, he was still evil. And of course we know from Romans 6:23, the first part, it says the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin. It doesn't say of certain sins. There is no partiality in the judgment on sins. Although there are degrees in sins, the judgment is just the same. And of course also in James it says, in James 2 verse 10, if you offend the law in one point, you are guilty of all. So if it comes to judgment and guilt, it doesn't matter which degree of sin it is. Sin is sin. Evil is evil. There is no difference there. So the second thing we can learn from this is that you can make a step in the right direction, or steps in the right direction, without eliminating the root of the sin. It's still there. Jehoram made a good step. This was a reform, taking away this image of Baal. It was also something that all the people could see and testify of. This is what our king did. And they probably felt good about it, because they knew, of course, this was against God's law, this image. So you can make a step in the right direction, but if you do not eliminate the root and all of it, then it's of little effect in the end. And this is what we see, of course, in many people. Many people make some reform in their lives, and then they proclaim they are Christians because of that. And usually, most of the cases, it is a change of habits. They change habits. And because of habits, they think they are Christians. They might stop swearing, and they might begin to read the Bible. They might go to church every week. They might, stop smoking, or all kinds of things which are habits. You can do all these things, and they are not bad in itself. Yeah, just like taking down the image of Baal was not a bad thing, actually was a good thing. But it's just changing habits, and if the root is not removed, then it's not eradicated. Changing habits does not make you a Christian. The change has to be within. And then the habits will change as a result of that, because there's a new creature. There is regeneration. And this is something you cannot do yourself, by no means. Changing habits, you can do it yourself. But changing the heart from within, only God can do it. What we also see here, it's actually literally mentioned, lesser evil is still evil. So Jehoram's character was still evil. This is something we have to recognize when you read the beginning of this chapter. And I missed this also the first time I read it. You have to read it a few times, as most of the times it's so. You have to recognize the character of Jehoram, because this sets the rest of the story. His character was still evil. He did not do away with these grave sins that his people Israel were doing. And so this is what God looks at when he judges us. He doesn't look at the few good things we might have done. He looks at our heart, our nature, our character. If that is not regenerated through the Holy Spirit, because we accepted his son Jesus, then it's no good. A good example of this is King Herod in Jesus' days. In Mark 6 verse 20, it speaks about him. It says, for Herod feared John, talking about John the Baptist, knowing that he was a just man and holy. He recognized this. He's just, he's holy. And he feared him for that, and he observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. He loved to listen to this holy man. And he did many things, it says. He was heeding to these words. This is typical for what many church people do, or many Christians. They like to listen to their favorite preacher, whether it's live or online, doesn't matter, and they do many things, but they're not changed. What did King Herod do in the end? He beheaded John. So much he loved him, and so much he feared him. So that's an illustration of outward Christianity and the inward man. And so therefore it says in Ezekiel 36 verse 27, God says, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. Only God can do this. Of course, we have to be willing, we have to make the step to approach and accept him, but then only he can do this change. So that sets the character here of Jehoram. And let's not forget he was the son of Ahab and Jezebel. So he had quote-unquote good examples, of course. So we continue then in verse 4 in 2 Kings 3. And Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheepmaster, and rendered unto the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with the wool. So again you have to go to the map. What is Moab? Moab is this piece of land east of the Dead Sea. It's a separate nation with their own king, King Mesha, and they were trading sheep and wool with Israel. And not a little bit, you see 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams. It was a big trade going on there. So, but it came to pass, when Ahab was dead, that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. And King Jehoram went out of Samaria the same time, and numbered all Israel. And he went to and sent to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, the king of Moab hath rebelled against me. Wilt thou go with me against Moab to battle? And he said, I will go up. I am as thou art, my people as thy people, and my horses as thy horses. And he said, which way shall we go up? And he answered, the way through the wilderness of Edom. And so the king of Israel went, and the king of Judah, and the king of Edom. And they fetched a compass of 7 days' journey, and there was no water for the host, and for the cattle that followed them. And the king of Israel said, alas, that the Lord hath called these 3 kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. But Jehoshaphat said, is there not here a prophet of the Lord, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? And one of the king of Israel's servants answered and said, here is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, which poured water on the hands of Elijah. And Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Okay. What is happening? Mesha, his name is mentioned once. He's the king of Moab. His name is mentioned once. That's interesting to observe. I realized only after I read this chapter a few times what is happening with the names. It's a very interesting thing. He's mentioned once because he's introduced to us. We know now who it is. After that, he's no longer called by name. He is called the king of Moab. He's never called Mesha again. So this is just a historical fact that he's Mesha, but he is the king of Moab. I'll get back to that. Anyway, there is this trade going on, and if you go back to 1 Kings, you will see that the king of Moab also rebelled against Ahab, but he failed. Now it says Ahab died, yeah, and now he rebels again. Now he thinks, this unexperienced young son is now king of Israel, I can deal with him. And he rebels again. It's a trade war. There's a trade war going on. And if you go in history, you see that trade wars often result in military wars. And that's interesting to think of in the current light of the current situation in the world. Trade wars often result in military wars. Here it's not different. Jehoram, he wants to do something, and he sends his messengers to Jehoshaphat to see if he will ally with him. Exactly the same you read in 1 Kings. It has happened before. It's not the first time that a king approaches Jehoshaphat to ask him, will you go to battle with me? And the response of Jehoshaphat is literally the same. It's just copy-paste. He said, of course I will, because you are as I am, and your horses are my horses. The exact same words he has said before. And Jehoshaphat is an experienced leader, and we'll see he thinks quite differently than Jehoram does. Now, think of Jehoram. Again, we are introduced to him in the first verse. His name is mentioned, and then I think one more time in verse 6. And King Jehoram went out of Samaria. From that moment on, Jehoram's name is no longer mentioned. He is simply addressed as the king of Judah, of Israel. And there's a reason for this. This is disrespect. When the name is mentioned, it means that the person lives up to his name. Well, his name means God raised up. God is not raised up in his name, and he is not raised up by God, because he doesn't care actually. His name is no longer, he's not worthy of this name. He's no longer mentioned by name. So that's just an interesting thing to observe. I think there was another example a few weeks ago, but I forgot now. Anyway, so like the king of Moab, the king of Israel goes nameless through the story. And it's not by chance, but they are of the same kind. They are of the same kind, and that determines actually the conclusion of this chapter. Jehoram had put away the image of Baal, but there was no change in his heart. It was outward religion and outward conformity to God's law. It made him feel good, I'm sure, but it also made the people feel good. Now we have a king that adheres to God's laws. Meanwhile, we still keep worshipping the golden calves, but that's another story. But it's outward, it's just a little gesture, and it's actually useless as long as the heart is not right, as we said before. And Jehoram now shows that he totally disregards God. He is not a ruler that respects God at all. First of all, he relies for his safety on people. The king of Moab rebels against him, and the first thing he does is not to seek God for guidance. The first thing he does is go to another king to ask for help. And he involves all of his nation. He actually jeopardizes all of his nation, because going to battle is always a risk that you lose. And in any case, most of the time you lose soldiers. And whether you win the war or not, you will lose people. So without consulting God, he's now dragging in the lives and livelihoods of others. And he hopes and relies on the strength of his army. But secondly, he seeks human help. In Jehoshaphat, he asked Jehoshaphat, will you go up with me to battle? And then it's an interesting thing, because in verse 8 it says, and he said, now who's the he can be debated, and there are several explanations, but it's most likely that the he there is Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat says, okay, I will go with you to battle, and he asks then, what's your plan? Which way shall we go up? What's your plan of battle? Which is a logical question. You plan to go to battle, you ask me to be your ally. What is the plan? And so again, what does Jehoram do? He doesn't say, let's ask God or one of his prophets what we should do. No, he's very sly. He says, we go through the wilderness of Edom. Now again, if you look at the map, Moab, the northern border of Moab, borders with Israel. That is why they could easily trade things, of course. So the obvious thing would be to go from the north, from Israel. Israel is waging war against Moab. Not Edom, not Judah, they are allies, okay. But it would be logical, honorable, for the king of Israel, Jehoram, to say, we go from the north, you come into my land, I will feed the soldiers, I will make sure that we are at full strength on the northern border and then we can attack. No, he's avoiding his own territory completely. This is, of course, a cowardly act, actually. No, we will go through Judah, we will go all the way through the wilderness, we will go through Edom. We have to drag Edom also into this war because of that. So the king of Edom also becomes an ally. So there is no God in this whole story. He's leaning on his own understanding, as inexperienced as he is. And he's dragging another nation, or it's not really a nation, but another area into this war. And this is typically something what we often do. It's easy now to point at Jehoram and say how wrong he was, but these are mirrors and lessons for us, of course. Proverbs 3 verse 5, it says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not on thine own understanding. This is what we are supposed to do. Most of the times we do the opposite. We think, we plan, we plot, we think we are smart and we do things our way. And that has consequences. Psalm 118 verse 8 also says, it's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. Jehoram disregards God. He does not respect God, and he does the opposite. He trusts man. He knows Jehoshaphat is an experienced warrior, experienced leader, also warrior. He has won battles, and so he thinks that's a good ally. And we also go through his territory, not through mine. I'm not involved. If anything goes wrong, I'm still good. And so this is what he does. And it's a big contrast of what people that walk with the Lord do. Like Moses decided in the Exodus before entering the promised land, which he personally did not do, but he said to God, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up thence. If it's not with you, then don't lead us there, because it will be disaster. And that is the right attitude of the Christian. If you're not with me, Lord, then I don't want to go there. But we have to seek his guidance. We have to consult. And that's what Jehoram did not do. So when God's guidance is not sought, then God's blessing cannot be expected. And this is a truth. When God's guidance is not sought, God's blessing cannot be expected. And we will see it. So we have now 3 kings that are joined together. The king of Edom is also not named by name. It's also historically not known who this was. Edom didn't have actually a king to begin with. It's not a kingdom. It was an area that had a deputy. Also this you can read in 1 Kings. So it's not really a king to begin with. He's like a deputy, sort of governor. But in any case, he is also now part of the battle. And of course, you can imagine that he basically has nothing to do with this, the land of Edom. But they will suffer the most because they border on Moab. So if there's any overspill over the border, fighting on the border, it's Edom who suffers the most of this. And the people who live along the border. And of course, Jehoram knows this. He would have this loss on the northern border if he would have attacked from there. now he avoids this. So the three kings are joined. They journey through the wilderness. It's, as you can see in the map, it's a distance, and with this mass of troops, because now it's two armies and the third one joining, and lots of cattle, it takes time. You would think, why do they bring cattle with them? Well, soldiers need to eat. It's very simple. They need to eat, and they did not have refrigerated trucks with them. So the best thing to keep your food fresh is to have it walk by itself, live cattle, and you could slaughter them and eat whenever you need. That's what they did. That's one reason why they had cattle. The second reason I come to in a minute. And so now they have not enough water because it's wilderness there. This is another not well thought through thing. Jehoram thinks of himself and avoiding his own territory, but he had the river Jordan there. He had wells, springs. He could have provided water for the army, but now there's not enough water. And now you see in verse 10, you see something so typical. And the king of Israel, so here he goes without name, the king of Israel said, "Alas, that the Lord had called these three kings together." Oh, really? The Lord has called the three kings together. Wow, now he thinks of the Lord. Now that things do not go well, he thinks all of a sudden of the Lord. The Lord has brought these kings together. Why? To have them die. To deliver them into the hand of Moab. What a bad God is this, who did this to us. He thinks of God, but he thinks of God in a bad way, namely as one who caused all this misery. This is typical for what we do. We so often blame God for the consequences of our own actions. We don't consult God, we follow our own ways, our own plans, our own heart, and then when trouble comes, then we blame God for letting him eat the fruit of our own decisions. It's typical. And if you read it here, you think, how stupid can he be? But this is how stupid most of us very often are. And now it's Jehoshaphat who suggests to call the Lord. Why not ask a prophet of the Lord? In other words, he's saying to Jehoram, why didn't you do this to begin with? Thought you had a good plan, but it's not from God. Jehoram never thought of this. And then it's ironic that it's one of the king of Israel's servants, so one of Jehoram's own servants, says there is Elisha. He's the prophet of God. He's the one who poured water on the hands of Elisha. They were so close together. He was even washing his hands. So, if the servant of Jehoram knew this of course also, but he didn't think of these things. He had no respect for this. Now, you see also from this that Elisha still was known for the reputation of Elisha. He was pouring water on the hands of Elisha. He was not so much known for his own miracles. Well, that is changing as we go along, because much more than Elisha is the prophet of miracles. He is doing one after the other miracle. So they think now of God. And it's Jehoshaphat who says in verse 12, the word of the Lord is with him, with Elisha. He says, no, it's not because he washed the hands of Elisha, it's because the word of the Lord is with him. He is truly a man of God. This is a very powerful testimony that Jehoshaphat gives about Elisha. He recognizes him for who he is. He's a man of God. The word of God is with him. He's not a great prophet because his master was Elisha. He's a great prophet because God is with him. And Jehoshaphat understands this. He sees this. This also says a lot about the way of thinking of Jehoshaphat compared to Jehoram. And then something very strange happens. You read this, maybe you don't notice, but it says then, and Jehoshaphat, or it says the king of Israel at first, and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom, so you see only one of the three has a name, they went down to him. This is very strange. These three men are in the wilderness, with all their armies. They don't have water, and they leave everything behind to go to the prophet. This, in all the other narratives you find in the Bible where a king needs a prophet, he sends for the prophet. He never goes himself and leaves all his things behind to find this prophet. This does not happen. But here, 3 kings, they leave their armies and they go to visit Elisha. It's a very peculiar situation. And apparently, by the way, Elisha was not far away. He was in the area, apparently. This is, of course, God's providence. So, what happens? Now it becomes very interesting, if it's not already. In verse 13. And Elisha said unto the king of Israel, here he goes again without name, What have I to do with thee? Get thee to the prophets of thy father, and to the prophets of thy mother. And the king of Israel said unto him, Nay, for the Lord hath called these 3 kings together, to deliver them into the hand of Moab. And Elisha said, As the Lord of hosts liveth, before whom I stand, surely, were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not look toward thee, nor see thee. Now bring me a minstrel. And it came to pass, when the minstrel played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. And he said, Thus saith the Lord, make a valley full of ditches. For thus saith the Lord, You shall not see wind, neither shall you see rain. Yet that valley shall be filled with water, that you may drink, both ye and your cattle and your beasts. And this is but a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will deliver the Moabites also into your hand. And you shall smite every fenced city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree, and stop all wells of water, and mar every good piece of land with stones. And it came to pass in the morning, when the meat offering was offered, that, behold, there came water by the way of Edom, and the country was filled with water. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings were come up to fight against them, they gathered all that were able to put on armor, and upward and stood in the border. And they rose up early in the morning, and the sun shone upon the water. And the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, This is blood. The kings are surely slain, and they have smitten one another. Now therefore Moab to the spoil. And when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and smote the Moabites, so that they fled before them. But they went forward, smiting the Moabites, even in their country. And they beat down the cities, and on every good piece of land cast every man his stone, and filled it. And they stopped all the wells of water, and felled all the good trees. Only in Kir Hareseth they left the stones thereof. Howbeit the slingers went about it, and smote it. And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men that drew swords, to break through even unto the king of Edom. But they could not. Then he took his eldest son, that should have reigned in his stead, and offered him for a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him, and returned to their own land. What a story. History. Now, first of all, back to verse 13 where we began this part, we see what it means to be godly man. Elisha is a great example of that. Again, but I said this, it's only Elisha and Jehoshaphat that are mentioned by name. These are actually the men of God in the story. So the 3 kings appear on the doorstep of Elisha. Can you imagine? I was just thinking, think of 3 world leaders today. You can come up with a few, I think, and that they would just ring at your door, and you open the door, and here they are. Here they are. Was Elisha impressed? Did he fall down and bow down? No, not at all. It's very interesting what he says. He addresses right away the king of Israel, Jehoram. And he says, "What have I to do with thee?" That's what he says. And he's doing with that, what he says, he's doing two things that nowadays would be totally politically incorrect. And even in the eyes of many Christians, they are not done. First of all, he shows disrespect to the king of Israel. He doesn't respect him. And secondly, he judges him. And so, nowadays, this is not done. But this is actually what a man of God should do. He sees Jehoram for who he really is, namely an unbeliever. He's not impressed that he took down the image of Baal. He understands that this does not make him a man of God. He is just the same in his heart as his parents were. He is an unbeliever and he has nothing to do with that. As Paul writes, don't be unequally yoked together with the unbeliever. What business have I to do with you? Does it mean he has disrespect for authority? No. But if that authority has disrespect for God, he has nothing to do with it. And that should be the position of the Christian today. You have to really think about that. Elisha serves the king of the universe. He does not serve the king of Israel. He does not serve the king of Judah. He does not serve any earthly king. He serves the king of the universe first, the king of kings. And the fact that Jehoram is a king, it does not change him at all. He's not impressed by that at all. And I'm sure it was quite an impressive party that came to him. These three kings for sure did not come alone. They would have brought with them some soldiers to guard them and to carry stuff for them, whatever. But he's not impressed by that. In Elisha's eyes, Jehoram is an idolater. He is a sinner. He is an enemy of God. He is fake. This is what he sees. Many people might, even in Israel, might be impressed. We have a king who took down the statue of Baal. We are going in God's ways. And Elisha sees what it really is. It is fake. It is meaningless. And you think of this, there are two things you can say. There are many, many Christians like that. They are fake. They do things outwardly and they create some impression, but in reality there is nothing. And if we do not have the discernment like Elisha did, which is God-given discernment, to recognize that and to judge it, we are in big trouble. We are in big trouble. Elisha is not afraid to tell him. And he goes a step further. He doesn't only say what I had to do with you. He says, go and serve the gods of your father and the gods of your mother. Who were they? The god of his father, Ahab, was Baal. The god of his mother, Jezebel, was Ashtoreth. Remember that Jezebel was the daughter of the priest of Sidon. The Sidonian goddess was Ashtoreth. Sidon is, by the way, along the coast on the map, would be north of Zarephath, on the coast of today's Lebanon. There is Sidon. That's where Jezebel came from. Her father was there, the priest of Ashtoreth, the goddess of Sidonia. And this is where we get the name Ishtar, where we get the name Easter. That's why Easter is not proper name for Christians to use. It's Passover. But anyway. So he says, go to these gods, because those are the ones you really serve. Not my God. You have served them always in your prosperity. And now you're in trouble and now you want help from my God, from the only true God. And of course, there must also have been some other emotions running through Elisha, because he knew how much Jezebel and Ahab persecuted Elisha, his master. And as soon as he followed his master, he was part of that persecution, subject of that persecution. So that must have also stirred up this fierceness in his response here. So unlike Elisha, many Christians today are impressed. And so this is the other part. They are impressed because a king does a certain gesture. And a king today, you can easily replace it with a president. A president or a prime minister does something, a gesture. He takes down the statue of Baal, metaphorically, and the people are impressed. We have now finally a Christian leader. This is a man of God. We will now be blessed by God. Well, you have to see through that all this is fake. It's fake. The heart has not changed. And of course, Christians will say right away, no, but wait, Romans 13, you have to be subject to the higher powers. Romans 13 is misused more now than ever. Romans 13, Paul gives the exact same conditions that Elisha uses. Because he says, because these powers are subject to God. Jehoram is not subject to God. He doesn't have anything to do with it. The higher powers, quote unquote, that we have, they are not subject to God. And so we also have to, as Christians, have the courage to say boldly and without being ashamed, what have I to do with you? And if such a leader goes stand in front of a church waving a Bible, we have to say, go serve your own God. What are you doing? Instead of praising him as being a Christian. It's fake. And if you cannot see it's fake, then I don't know what, but you're blind, because just like Jehoram, he did not do away with all the other sins. All the other abominations, they are just going on just the same. The things that the ones before him installed. We need discernment and we need boldness. We need to be clear. Elisha is very clear. There are 3 kings here in front of him, and they have soldiers with him. They could just chop off his head and that was it. He doesn't think of that. He's not afraid of that. He stands without shame and he tells the truth. What have I to do with you? That's what we should say to leaders that we have before us today. And whether he's a king or a president or a celebrity, name another name, Kanye West, oh, he's now become a Christian, he has a Bible, he preaches. No, it's all fake. If you cannot see through it, I don't know, but it's very simple. Nothing has changed in the behavior, nothing has changed in the life. And people say, yeah, you have to give them time and all this. Of course, pray for these people that they get saved for real. That's all I can say. But don't be a flunky Christian and just follow blindly these people. The so-called King Cyrus is probably more like King Jehoram. And just like King Jehoram, he's not worthy to carry the name. So, what did Jehoram do? Now that Elisha says this, Jehoram cannot speak freely because Jehoshaphat is there and the king of Edom. He has a war to wage and he needs now God's blessing. So he goes on in his sly behavior. He says in verse 13, this last part, nay, for the Lord hath called these 3 kings together. He repeats the lie he had before. It's the Lord who brought them together. Really? No, he didn't. He's lying through his teeth. The Lord had brought these kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Now we will get destroyed. What a bad God. You have to do something. Elisha is a true man of God. He uses his discernment. He judges righteously. Often people, Christians and non-Christians, use this when you say something about someone else. Thou shalt not judge, that thou may not be judged. Matthew 7. Well, it's part of Matthew 7. It's out of context. But apart from that, what does Jesus say in John 7:24? Judge, but not according to appearance, but judge righteously. That's what Elisha does. He doesn't judge according to appearance. If he had done that, the appearance was, first of all, it's a king, it's authority, and secondly, he took down the statue of Baal. So if you judge according to that, you have to be on your knees. He didn't judge, he judged righteously. Righteous judgment. That's what we should do. Interesting, by the way, about this statue of Baal. Ironically, the current president of the United States and also other world leaders, by the way, they erected the Ark of Baal in their cities. So they did actually the opposite. They made it even worse. can think about that. But anyway, so it's only because of Jehoshaphat that Elisha continues with them. He pulls himself together. He says, okay, there are 2 more men here. Okay, the king of Edom is, he has actually no real role, but Jehoshaphat is here. And he says, it's only because of him. If he was not here, I would not even look at you. I would not see you. I would totally ignore you. But because of him, I will continue. And Jehoshaphat was considered a godly man. He was certainly not perfect, but he was a godly man. In 2nd Chronicles 17, verse 3, it reads, "And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the first ways of his father David, and sought not unto Baalim, but sought unto the Lord God of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not after the doings of Israel. Therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought to Jehoshaphat presents. And he had riches and honor in abundance, and his heart was lifted up in the ways of the Lord. Moreover, he took away the high places and groves out of Judah." It's interesting what you see here. He was walking in the ways of his father David, and he walked in the Lord's commandments. He had respect. He was obeying God, and because of that, he was blessed with riches. And because of that, because of his character, he took down the high places. This is the opposite of what Jehoram did. Jehoram took down the high place and thought that would change him. It didn't, of course. At least Elisha did not fall for this trick. Here it's the opposite. So it's because of him, because of Jehoshaphat, that Elisha continues with them. And because of that, Jehoram is sort of blessed, because they are together, they are allies. It's not because it's grace upon Jehoram, because God changed his mind about Jehoram. It's only because of Jehoshaphat. And so you see often what we read in Matthew 5, verse 45. God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he makes the rain fall on the just and on the unjust. So often we see that the unjust or the evil, they are blessed along with the just. That does not save them, by the way. They can enjoy this for a while, but if they don't change, it's still too bad. Okay, we quickly continue. Then we get Elisha has now to be the mouthpiece of God. And you can imagine that Elisha was somewhat upset by the presence of Jehoram. That's what you read between the lines. And what we learn from Elisha throughout all the scripture is that he was not a person to act upon his emotions, not at all. And so he must have felt that his spirit was stirred up. He was emotional to a certain extent, and he wanted to get rid of this before he would say anything. And so he says, "Bring me a minstrel." And when you read this, you think right away of King Saul and David. King Saul, who was oppressed by evil spirits that gave him this depression and this aggression, and so David played for him on his harp, and then it says, while he played, the evil spirit departed from him. So you see two things with music when it is anyway, when it's sacred music, it soothes the spirit. This is just we talked about it a while ago. This is just a process that happens in our brains. But from the story of Saul and David, we see that it also has an effect on the demons, and so it might have also here this dual purpose to soothe the spirit of Elisha, but at the same time to counter the evil spirit that was upon Jehoram, just as it did in King Saul. And so it says, while the minstrel played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. He turned to himself. He was in the spirit again, we would say. And then he prophesies on behalf of these allies. God promises an abundance of water, but no rain would fall. He says, and no wind would bring the water. So he's going to do a miracle. And he would use the same water also to confuse the enemy. Now, before that, they had to dig ditches. You think again, there is an army. They have walked for several days, a big army, walked for several days through the desert. They have cattle with them. The cattle must also have been very restless because they were also thirsty. And now they have to dig ditches. They have to work. It doesn't just come, it doesn't just fall. God could have said the same. He said to Moses, smite the rock and water will flow out. Or speak to the rock the second time and water will flow out. Easy. God could have done the same thing. He's done it before. But no, he says you have to dig ditches. Here, now they have to act on faith. Common sense says, I'm not going to make ditches. Ditches have no use if there's no well to fill these ditches. If there's no source to fill them, then there's no use to doing so. So common sense would say, no, we're not going to do that. We get even more tired. But this was now a work of faith, and this is often what God requires from us. He asks something from us to do something that to us, to our common sense, doesn't make sense actually. But we have to work in faith. And then he will do the miracle. And it says it was a light thing in the sight of the Lord. But it was a great miracle. Also, some might say, well, maybe the groundwater level was very high, and so when you dig a bit, like a few feet deep, and the groundwater level is high, then the ditches will fill themselves automatically with water. But this was not the case, because they dug the ditches, they were dry. It says the water came in the morning, not when they were digging. They were dry. They went to sleep, it didn't rain, there was no wind, nothing, and in the morning the water came. When did the water came? This is interesting also. In verse 20, it came to pass in the morning when the meat offering was offered that behold there came water by the way of Edom. While they were doing the meat offering. What? Were they doing a meat offering? Yes. Why? Because we just read from Chronicles, Jehoshaphat walked in the Lord's commandments. And it was part of the Lord's commandments to have a meat offering in the morning hour. And so this is what they did. And it shows also how obedient Jehoshaphat was even here in the wilderness. And this is the second reason why they had cattle with them, to make offering. And so this was obviously not part of Jehoram's mindset, nor of the king of Edom, but this was Jehoshaphat who was doing this. And this then reminds us of something else, namely of the ritual of the water libation. Water appearing during the morning sacrifice is exactly what happened during the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkoth, when every morning during this feast the priest would take water from the pool of Siloam and pour it on the temple square, and there was a ritual called the water libation. And during the last day of the Feast of Sukkoth, that was the most important day, we read in John 7, we read it of course last fall, in verse 37, that in that last day, the great day of the feast, so that's Sukkoth, Tabernacles, Jesus stood and cried, saying, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink, and that he that believeth on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. So there Jesus is linking this ritual to himself as being the source of the living water. And that happened during the hour of the morning sacrifice. So it's very interesting that we see this parallel here during the meat offering. This water now gave life to the Israelites. They had waited for this. They were thirsty and they will have drunk so much, I'm sure. But the same water appeared as blood to the Moabites. It was life-giving to the Israelites. It was the defeat for the Moabites, for the enemy. And this is again something so interesting if you think of Jesus being the source. See what happened on the cross when Jesus died. He died on the cross, and then the Roman soldiers came to basically break the legs, but they saw that Jesus was already dead, pierced him with a spear in his side. And it says in John 19 verse 34, but one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. Blood and water, and we see it here, it's blood and water. And these pictures are so beautiful because we see God has not changed, and He will never change, and He's giving them basically victory through His Son Jesus. This is how we have victory over the enemy. That's what we can see here.
Water of life mixed with your precious blood goes down.
And so now they are, the Moabites are confused. They see this blood and they think the armies must have gone against each other. This was not a strange thing to happen when armies allied. They could also have a dispute among themselves and begin to fight each other. And so this is what they reasoned. It made sense actually. They had never seen the reflection of water or liquid in that place. As they saw it from the distance, there were no ditches there before, so they could not understand that this was the red sun reflecting on this water. And so they came out to attack, and then they were actually attacked, and the Israelites moved forward across the border into Moab, and they did exactly what Elisha had foretold. They destroyed the cities, they stopped the wells. This was devastating for them because, as we read, they were sheep masters. They had hundreds of thousands of sheep. They needed water very much. And by stopping the wells, their livelihood was over. These animals would die in days, and they themselves, of course, had a big problem. So they moved on, except for Kir Haraset, it says. Kir Haraset is called in Hebrew Kir Cheres. It means wall of earthenware. Interesting, earthenware. Many walls in those days were stones that they had quarried and just put on top of each other. But this was earthenware. They were bricks. You have to think back of the days of Nimrod. That's the first time we read in the Bible that man began to build with bricks. The reason most likely is that before the flood, the giants could handle these big monolithic stones. After the flood, these giants were no longer present, and the giants that came later were not that big. And so, in order to deal with building, they invented, probably this was given knowledge, to make bricks. That's what we see here, earthenware. But it was Kir Cheres was the fortress of Moab. It's also mentioned in Isaiah and Jeremiah. The fortress of Moab was a very big stronghold. It was the royal city. It was the strongest city, and you might compare it with how Jericho was before God destroyed it. It really had probably the measurements of a city for giants. It was a huge thing, and they could not just breach it. And so what did they do? They brought in the slingers, it said, and smote it. So they were successful to do it with slingers. What were slingers? You think first of all of slingstone, what David used against Goliath, but most likely these were catapults that they used to hurl rocks against these earthenware walls. And if you do this, these bricks will of course break, and eventually you will breach the wall. And they were apparently successful in doing so, because the king of Moab was now very afraid. He saw he could not win. And the battle was too sore for him, it says. And he, with 700 men, he tried to break through. He couldn't. He had to go back into the city. And then he does what he does. He sacrifices his son. This was an ultimate deed. You can read it in different ways. You can see it as a surrender. I give up. Here is my son. He would be king after me. There's no more kingship. It's over. This is one part of it. But it was also probably to appease, on one side maybe the wrath of God, the God that was with the Israelites, but more likely he was offering his son to his own god. The god of the Moabites was Chemosh. We can read this also in 1 Kings, and or Chemosh it is. And so he was probably sacrificing his son to this god. And it was the most valuable sacrifice you could give. In Micah 6 verse 7 it says, "Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" It's a rhetorical question, but it is to show I cannot give anything more than that. It's the ultimate gift. It's the ultimate sacrifice. And what does the king of Moab do? He does it on the wall. He wants to make sure that everyone can see it. So this is really the intention. And most of all, we know this was a pagan practice. In 2 Chronicles 33, verse 6, it says, "And he," that's Manasseh, "he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also, he observed times, and he used enchantments, and used witchcraft, and dealt with a familiar spirit and wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger." He did everything that God had said they should not do. Before they entered the promised land, we read in Deuteronomy 18 verse 10, that God lists all these things. These were the people surrounding them were doing these things, and they should not do them. And here Manasseh was doing exactly these things, but he caused his children to pass through the fire. He was sacrificing. They were sacrificing their children. That's the point. Also in Psalm 106 verse 37, it says, "Yeah, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto devils." It's talking here about God's people, by the way. So that is what it's a great abomination in the sight of the Lord. And you would think now God would be extremely angry with the Moabites, and he would cause fire to come down from the sky or whatever, give Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and the king of Edom now the victory to completely destroy the city. No, there came great wrath against Israel. You read this, you think, why is this? Wrath from who? Why against Israel? Israel was not doing this. The Moabites were doing this. Again, this is one of these things many have no explanation for this. But here we have to, it's confusing language. We have to separate Israel from Judah. Often it's called Israel, referring to all of Israel. And other times it's called Israel, referring only to the house of Israel, separate from Judah. And I think that's how we have to read it here. In Hebrew it simply says Yisrael, so you cannot really determine, but also in the beginning, throughout this passage, the king of Israel, Jehoram, is also called the king of Yisrael, so it's the same word. Then it makes sense, namely, because Jehoram is serving the gods of his father and his mother. He is doing all these practices that the Moabites are also doing. The worst things. They are paganists of the highest order. They are rebelling against God 100%. That's why Elisha said, "What have I to do with you?" Now they stand at the foot of this wall of the city, and Jehoram must have been full of spirit because of their great victory, which was not because of him, it was not blessing for him, it was only because God was with Jehoshaphat, his ally. And now came the point that Jehoram got a mirror in front of him, you can say. God was showing him, this is you. What this king is doing, that's what you are doing. You are a great abomination. This is a very bad thing. And you will have the same fate that you brought upon these people of Moab. You will be utterly destroyed if you continue this path. That's why we see that right from the beginning, both the king of Moab and the king of Israel go nameless. They are the same. They are of the same kind. And when Jehoram's parents installed all this paganism in Israel, the one thing that they did not do is sacrificing their own children. They knew this was one step too far, and this would kindle the anger of God against them. And so they never did this. And now we see that this king of Moab makes this step, and he does it because he's attacked, because he's cornered. And the source of that, the reason of that, is Jehoram. So he must have understood, and the Israelites in general must have understood, this is us. This is our fate, actually. And so they gave up and they returned to their own land. Sometimes God's providence helps one to be shaken up and to see his error. It is so far in the battle, Jehoram was blessed, not because of him, but because of Jehoshaphat. And that is also a form of grace. God could also have stopped him right away and get him out of the way. Jehoram had gotten many, many signals, even throughout this story, that he had to return to God's ways. As soon as Elisha had said, "What have I to do with you?" he should have thought, yes, actually nothing. I'm on the wrong side. He didn't. He covered it with a lie and he continued. And so there were several instances where he could have changed, and he didn't. So there are many men like him, kings and presidents, and so-called ordinary people. But until they repent and bear the fruits of repentance, we should be like Elijah when we encounter them and say, "What have I to do with thee?" We should not be ashamed, and we should not also be afraid to judge righteous judgment, to tell the truth. Because these people like Jehoram with this spirit, they are not willing to listen to the gospel in general. They know. Jehoram knew very well who his nation belonged to. That's not the point, but they need to be confronted with their error. And this is what happened here in the end of the story. Throughout the story, but certainly in the end. So it's an interesting piece of history that shows us what it means to be a man of God, and how to approach those that rebel against God. There is a difference between a godless person, an unsaved person, and one that rebels against God. That's what Jehoram did, and also the king of Moab. They rebel against God. You have to approach them differently. First of all, you're not of the same kind. What have I to do with you? Go serve your own gods. They have to be called and confronted with their grave error. We need discernment. We need also courage, boldness. And in this time more than ever. And it's very hard because everyone talks always about being politically correct, not being a bigot, not to discriminate, and all these things you hear all the time in order to stop us from speaking. But we should be like Elisha. We should not be impressed by these things and just say things the way they are. Amen.